Around 1960, you stand in a platform in West Germany, waiting for your train. When it finally arrives, you see it pulled in by a steam locomotive. Surprisingly bunker first. But this is not a tank engine, and certainly no branch-line locomotive either. Let me introduce you to Germany's backwards-facing push-and-pull mainline steam locomotives. While the early Deutsche Bundesbahn, the Federal Railway of West Germany, had an excess of modern goods locomotives, primarily those built during the Second World War, there was a significant lack of medium-sized modern passenger machines. Production of new locomotives started no later than in 1950 with the Class 23. However, their production was not quick enough to satisfy the imminent demand. Therefore, the Deutsche Bundesbahn looked for ways to adapt and modernize already existing machines. The most numerous passenger machine at that point was still the Prussian P8, or in German, Preußische P8, now referred to as Class 38.10-40. The P8s were a very successful class, firstly introduced in 1906. Production for German railways lasted until the 1920s, even longer when considering export and license builds. And no replacement had yet been built in significant numbers, while the Deutsche Bundesbahn still inherited over 1200 examples of them. By now their age really started to show. Not only were many machines worn out, in particular their tenders could not stand up to modern expectations. These Prussian tenders were fairly small, enabling the P8s to be freely used even on lines with short turntables, but could only hold very limited amounts of water and coal. And these short turntables were mostly gone by now, but the small tenders still remained, limiting the P8's reach significantly. Additionally, these tenders had very poor running abilities, constraining the P8's backward speed to only 50 km per hour. At the same time, however, a lot of large and modern tub-style tenders with excellent running abilities from withdrawn wartime locomotives became available. A perfect match. Kind of. You see, without modification, the P8s were not compatible with these tub tenders. While traditionally tender locomotives feature an open cab, with the access stairs being mounted to the tender, the new tenders didn't have these, but without modification required a fully enclosed cab with side doors. While at first the tenders were adapted accordingly and fitted with access steps, by far the easiest and quickest solution. This left a lot of unused potential. While the tub tenders had much better riding abilities, compared to the old Prussian ones, these couldn't be really made use of, as a still fully open cab gave the crew no protection at high backward speeds. Because of this, for later rebuilds instead of the tender, the cab was modified with side doors, steps and a closed rear wall, featuring only a circular opening, allowing access to the tender. The gap between tender and cab was enclosed by a rubber ring, similar to those used between passenger wagons. Now the backward speed could be raised from 50 km per hour to 85, coming close to the 100 forwards, alongside the new water capacity of 30 cubic meters rather than 21.5, increasing their reach significantly. This rebuild proved to be very successful. The new P8s were happily running backwards and didn't need any turntables anymore. But they still had to run around the train at terminal stations. So 41 examples were taken even further and received an indirect push and pull equipment. Paired with a command car at the other end of the train, the locomotive could now always remain in the same position, no matter which direction the train went. But let me explain to you how this actually worked. While the train was running locomotive first, it was business as usual, with the driver and fireman on the footplate. Running command car first, however, required the driver to take place in a special compartment inside said command car, from which they could observe the route and send orders to the fireman, who remained on the engine and was now in charge of operating the locomotive, according to the driver's requests. The driver in turn had no direct way of influencing the train's behavior, with the only exception being the brakes for safety reasons. As this demanded quite a lot of the firemen, who still had to maintain the fire at the same time. They were required to have completed the driver apprenticeship also, ensuring the necessary knowledge of all the controls. Generally, the push and pull steam locomotives of the Deutsche Bundesbahn were orientated with the smoke box facing towards the train, meaning they would either pull the train backwards or push it forwards. This was done in the view towards the back of a steam locomotive is usually better than towards the front, due to the bunker being a lot shorter than the boiler. And to some extent, this is still true for the tender locomotive. This orientation of the locomotive, however, was not mandatory, like the trains around Hamburg showed. Here, the rebuilt P8s were coupled with a tender towards the train, resulting in reverse to the quite unusual image of a tender locomotive pushing a train tender first. But this had a very good reason. While the P8s were only allowed 85 km per hour backwards in opposition to 100 forwards, this was only the case when the tender was leading the train. When, however, the command car was leading the train, the rebuilt P8s could always go 100 km per hour, even when the locomotive was running tender first, as the tender was now sandwiched between the locomotive and the first wagon, giving it additional stability. The indirect control of the locomotive, with the fireman having to carry out the orders of the driver, however, was from the beginning destined to only be short-lived. It reliably did what it was intended to do, but it was quite convoluted and awkward compared to direct push and pull control new-built diesel and electric locomotives offered. So it is no surprise that these quickly took over the place of the fitted P8s, ending their push and pull service in the mid-1960s. This, however, didn't result into their withdrawal, as they could just as well be used for regular trains, and they often were used for regular trains even before. The P8s were in general very versatile machines. This, combined with a large number, allowed them to last until the 1970s, but they didn't make it quite to the end of steam in West Germany, as the last ones were withdrawn in 1974, 3 years early. While many P8s made it into preservation and continue to prove their versatility there, unfortunately I'm not aware of a single push and pull locomotive still in existence today. Which is quite a shame, as these machines, albeit short-lived, mark the final and most advanced development stage of the famous Prussian P8. Then again, the push and pull P8s were never glamorous machines, but rather a short-time necessity, standing in the shadow of newer and bigger locomotives, leaving them quite underappreciated, even among enthusiasts today. Quite unfortunate, as they proved, the usefulness of a locomotive is not determined by its age, but rather by how well it can be adapted to the ever-changing needs and demands. I always enjoyed the look of the top tender P8s, as the long round tenders give them quite an elegant appearance, despite the anachronistic nature of this combination being very obvious. So I'm very happy I finally could create this locomotive as the fourth version of my model of the Prussian P8. Have a look at my Instagram page to find renders of the other versions, and let me know in the comments which locomotive you would like to see a video about next. Thank you for joining me, and see you next time at Steel Bridge Models.